In this presentation, I'm going to be applying a variety of emotions on Mildred Loving. First, I'm going to be talking about the movie summary of Loving by Jeff Nichols. To start, the main characters in this movie are Richard, who is a Caucasian, and Mildred Loving, who is an African American. They live in the state of Virginia where interracial marriage is illegal, but decide to get married in DC where it is accepted. Once married, they return to Virginia, where the sheriff finds out about the marriage and throws both of them in jail, where they were given the option to face a sentence in jail or to leave the state for 25 years with no return together. To avoid jail time because of an upcoming child on the way, they leave to busy DC, where they realize the city life is just not for them, as they much prefer the country life surrounded by trees and fields. They end up back in jail in Virginia when they return to give birth to their child by Richard's mother. When they face the judge again for their sentencing, their lawyer made up an excuse as to why they returned. He said, "I told them they could return for the birth of their child. My mistake." The judge gives them a second chance to stay away, and so they did. 3 kids later, and when being hit by a car, Mildred had enough of the city life and wanted something to change. Mildred gets in touch with an attorney general who believes he can fight for their rights for interracial marriage in Virginia. After waiting, Mildred finally receives a phone call that the American Civil Liberties Union wants to take her case and help fight for her. They find another lawyer who is rich in material for helping people get their cases to the Supreme Court. The Virginia Supreme Court rules against them, which allows them to take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the end, Mildred finally gets the phone call that the Supreme Court has taken down any interracial marriage laws in the state of Virginia. To end, Richard and Mildred live in the house Richard wanted to build them from the start, with their 3 kids. In the titles at the end of the movie, we learn that just 7 years after this occurred, Richard died in a car accident and Mildred lived to last until 2018. Now I am going to be summarizing Mildred Loving. Mildred Loving was the mother of 3 kids and wife to Richard Loving in the movie. She became a reluctant activist in the civil rights movement shortly after her and her husband, Richard Loving, became illegally married in the state of Virginia due to interracial marriage laws. She displayed countless negative emotions almost throughout the entire movie until she moved back to her birthplace of Virginia, where she then had much more positive and happy outlook on life. Although Richard Loving, Mildred's husband, did not always want to go along with the court dates and everything that they had to do in order to make interracial marriage legal, Mildred continued to persevere and never gave up on fighting. Continued with such perseverance, Mildred and Richard finally won their case and made interracial marriage legal in 1967. In this presentation, I will be talking about 3 topics that highlight the character Mildred Loving in the movie. The 3 topics that I chose were emotion families, gender, and positive emotion. In each topic, I will be providing 3 examples that apply to each topic I chose about Mildred in this movie. Each topic will be described with a new scene every time from the movie. My first topic is emotion families. In Module 2, it was described that Ekman also found research suggesting that emotions can be grouped, which he called emotion families. Since he thought of anger as a basic emotion, there are also other emotions that coincide with this family of emotions, such as rage, sadness, irritation, fear, and frustration, most of which were displayed by Mildred throughout this movie. You can easily think of emotion families as groups of traits that relate to one another. Another example could be the joy family. For example, you could add happiness, gratitude, and satisfaction, all of which are positive emotions. In this first scene, I will be discussing emotions that belong to the anger family of emotions. This scene takes place at 23 minutes and 25 seconds to 23 minutes and 40 seconds. This emotion family happens fast. It all starts when Mildred and Richard Loving get thrown into jail because the sheriff found out they are in fact illegally married in Virginia. Richard got bailed out, but Mildred had to stay in. All alone in the jail cell, Mildred is curled up in the corner, hunched over, sitting on a cold bench. At this time, she is still pregnant. She hears a loud bang and yelling from outside the cell and is frightened. She stays in the cell until she gets bailed out the following day. The first example of this emotion family I will be discussing is fear. As described previously, Mildred is alone. When she hears a loud bang and yelling coming from outside of her cell, she right away is startled and jumps up. Her eyes widen so she can focus on what had just happened. Along with this fearful event that scared Mildred, her parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system are now in the works, allowing her heart rate to increase because she was frightened. She not only was scared for herself, but she also seemed to be scared for her unborn child as she held her baby bump in a way to protect it. The second emotion that I will be applying to this scene is frustration. Before the loud noise came, Mildred was sitting in the corner with her hand on her forehead, which most of the times indicates frustration within someone. That being said, this point of the movie does back up why she would be feeling frustrated, because her and her husband cannot be left alone to live freely amongst their state, because of the laws placed involving interracial marriages. I believe she was also frustrated by the fact that she could not get bailed out and had to wait until the following Monday, and also that she was pregnant and not being treated the way she should be. My last example for this topic is sadness. In this scene, like described earlier, Mildred is curled up and hunched over in the corner of her cell, away from any light being shone into the cell. In this scene, I chose to describe sadness as one of her emotions because usually being curled up and keeping to yourself and essentially making yourself small is an indication of sadness and knowing that you are looked down upon, which could also contribute to the fear emotion in this, as previously mentioned. My next topic is gender. There are differences in men and women when it comes to displaying emotions of certain topics. Most women respond by being so emotional and express more emotion than do men. This is in fact true for Mildred Loving in the movie. Some stereotypes say men experience more anger to form decisions, whereas women are thought to experience more happiness and sadness and less logic when facing decisions and judgments. This statement, however, seemed to not be so true for Mildred during the movie. In fact, Mildred used her many emotions to pour into fighting for her and her husband's rights, and used a tremendous amount of logic to fight. Gender and empathy also correlate with one another. Women show more empathy than do men, which is actually the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Rumination is also involved in gender. It is said that women tend to repeatedly think about the negative things in their lives, but this was a good thing for Mildred in the movie.
We're moving back to the country. I don't care what they do to us. I won't raise my family here.
The next scene describing gender to Mildred Loving is when one of their children gets hit by a car while playing on the busy streets of DC. Richard did not know about the incident until he came home from work and seen all of the bags packed. He called for Mildred and she explained to him what had happened. They sat downstairs on the couch and Mildred said directly to Richard, "I'm moving back to the country. I don't care what they do to us. I won't raise my family here." Throughout this scene, you could see Mildred continuously ruminating what had happened and what more could happen if they continued to live here. She proceeds until the end of the scene, crying into Richard's arms, where Richard has had a straight look and what seems to show no emotion the whole time. First, I will describe rumination to this scene. First is when you see Mildred throughout the scene ruminating through the negative feelings she is experiencing from the accident that just occurred. In the part of the scene where she is sitting on the couch with Richard, before he comes over, she is blankly staring, which is a strong indicator that she is thinking about something on her mind, which will most likely be the accident. It is said in the textbook that women tend to ruminate more than men, and think about negative occurrences and problems in their life more oftenly. A second example is when Mildred explains to Richard that she wants to leave back to Virginia and does not care what they will do to them. This sets a slight example on how women tend to be overly emotional and overdramatize issues they are facing. I have included this because if they do go back and get caught for being back in Virginia illegally, they could both face a larger issue than being in DC. Therefore, is Mildred really being overly dramatic about not caring what they do to her, especially if her children are part of their lives now? The answer to this seemed to be yes, because they did in fact move back to their old town. In my third and final example of gender, as explained before, women tend to be more emotional than men. As explained in the text and part of the modules, women experience and express stronger emotions in general and will generally cry more than men because they are expressing such a strong emotion. In this scene, Richard continues to keep a straight face and displays little to no emotion or any facial expressions, whereas Mildred breaks down into tears thinking about how horrible it is being here and that she wants to move back to her roots. It is greatly shown in this scene that men and women do in fact differ in emotions, because Richard never shed a tear, although he is most likely touched and hurt that his son got hit by a car and that Mildred wants to leave. He did not express any emotion as much as Mildred did. Throughout this movie, Mildred Loving went from a drastic change of events altering her emotions from negative to positive. It seemed as though every time something was going right, making her feel happy, it took a turn and thus made the situation negative. As nearing the end of the movie, when Mildred and Richard had hoped that one day they could live legally married in Virginia, Mildred started to show a more positive emotion scene by scene. There are many emotions that could be described nearing the end of the movie that Mildred fit characters explore. Hope and anticipation fit into an optimistic category of positive emotion, relief and satisfaction fit into gratification, and love and dreaminess fit into affection, all of which Mildred shows in the upcoming scenes I will get to.
Hello? Yes? Oh, hello, Mr. Cole. What's that? Yes, I'm here. It's wonderful news. Yes, I understand. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cole.
The next scene is taking place when Mildred gets a phone call that the U.S. Supreme Court made an interracial marriage legal in Virginia after a lengthy fight full of ups and downs. Prior to this scene, Mildred and Richard's lawyer had the court date with the Supreme Court. Mildred and Richard were home going on their usual day when Mildred hears the phone ring. She answers, and it is their lawyers. The lawyer explains to Mildred in short that they won the case, and you could tell from the actions Mildred was displaying that she was in such awe. She proceeded outside where her family was and seemed to be much happier and showed much more relaxation and satisfaction than she ever had in the movie before. It was obvious in this scene that she displayed joyfulness and happiness because of her smiles nearing the end of the phone call. This shows how facial expressions can contribute to emotions. I decided to leave this example out of this positive emotion because happiness that Mildred showed was an obvious trait. The first positive emotion I will be talking about in relation to Mildred Loving is her ounce of optimism. Optimism is defined in Module 9 to embrace hope and anticipation, both in which Mildred possessed in this scene. Mildred, throughout the scene as well as from upcoming events, was hopeful that this phone call would happen and that they would win their fight against the Supreme Court. She consistently anticipated this phone call until the day it happened and never gave up. When she received the phone call, she knew it was worth it all. She finally shows a sense of relief, and that I will be explaining in the next positive emotion. The second emotion Mildred shows in this scene is gratification, which is also defined in Module 9. That includes relief and satisfaction. Gratification was brought to Mildred Loving when she finally received the phone call that their case won. During the phone call, Mildred says to her lawyer, "That's wonderful news." This sentence may seem ordinary and not posing any gratification, but as she says it, there was a huge sigh from Mildred, signaling relief and satisfaction that this is all finally over. My third and final example of positive emotions that Mildred displays is affection, which is defined in Module 9 as well as showing love and dreaminess. Mildred shows affection near the end of the scene when she gets off the phone call with the lawyer. Although this is such exciting news, she keeps calm and smiles and admires her surroundings of her family and the fields where she can now live freely. She is also seen doing housework before the phone call took place, showing love towards her family by caring for them and doing chores for the household. And that concludes my presentation on Mildred Loving and the emotions that she displayed.